This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to Seven Samurai, currently streaming on HBO Max. But before we launch into this week's movie, next week we will be covering a Western classic that ties into this week's film, The Magnificent Seven. You won't want to miss that one, so catch it on Stars before next week's show. Also, you can still sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes. You can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. All right, so this week we are discussing Seven Samurai, a film that I'm sure that people who aren't film historians, or at least film literate, don't have a huge connection toward, or maybe knowledge of. Let's go with that. So, Dad, you and I have gotten more into foreign language or international movies over the last couple of years. What have you liked most about diving into this newer area of film, and in the case of this week, historical film?
I do like the fact that we've been able to see kind of the influence of foreign films on American films and how they have really kind of influenced both filmmaking as well as the concepts or ideas of films. This is kind of almost a historical legend film. I don't think there was too many films about samurai or that Western culture talked much about samurai until this film. So I do like the fact that we're able to get into it a little bit and see what else is out there. I don't mind subtitles necessarily, but they're not for everybody, and you do have to pay a little more attention than you normally would, but sometimes it's worth the wait, or the effort, I should say.
So I do agree with you that it does take a certain state of mind, because you have to concentrate a little bit more on the film. You can't casually watch something with subtitles just because of the amount of reading that you have to do, and I think that turns off a lot of people that are casually viewing most things when it comes to, let's say, this Netflix era. That being said, those that do want to invest in this, I know that people who like film have been particularly enamored the last 2 or 3 years with some really great international films. So we had Roma that almost won Best Picture 3 years ago now. We had Parasite, who did win Best Picture, controversially, I might add. And then a film that you and I watched, at least had somebody up for Best Director, was also a subtitled film, Another Round from Denmark, which this week also, in lieu of the Oscars, was announced that Leonardo DiCaprio is going to be remaking, which I find almost a travesty, that we feel we need to remake that in order to make it accessible to American audiences. But I guess meet the audience where they're at. I have had no problem with certain films being able to connect with them despite some of the language barrier, because as long as the translation is good, I think the same still can be pulled out of a movie regardless of what language it's in. Now, as for this film particularly, I know this is an extremely influential movie, and that Kirosawa particularly was extremely influential on a couple of very major directors. You want to talk about Spielberg has talked endlessly about Kirosawa. George Lucas used a lot of Kirosawa properties to base his Star Wars universe off of, using kind of the samurai culture or some of the things that he used either out of Seven Samurai or the Hidden Fortress to base the Star Wars universe off of. So as far as action films, you could say that there are elements of this even as far-reaching as something like The Matrix, which I know you haven't watched, so you can't agree with me on. But
yes,
this is something that is a staple of early film history, and I think it would be a disservice to our audience not to expand into this realm, regardless of the fact that it's not necessarily something that the popular audience is going to necessarily know or want to watch.
I agree. I mean, some people, you mention what you're doing and they roll their eyes, but I suggested Mom and Sarah sit down and watch it with me, and that got absolutely no further than a guffaw.
I, even from my own perspective, as someone who is a resident lover of movies, I've had accessibility problems sometimes trying to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to watch a 3.5 hour movie all in Japanese dubbed subtitles. Like, most people are not going to be able to sit through that, but making this as part of the podcast has kind of forced me to do some of this work, even though I knew that I wanted to eventually get here because of how much I enjoyed when I was in college watching Rashomon for the first time, which is another film I assume we will be covering at some point, along with several other Kurosawa films. So if you do happen to follow us down the rabbit hole this week, there's probably more where this comes from. We'll probably be doing Federico Fellini at some point as well, which will be Italian subtitles. We might be doing, can't think of the French.
Bergman.
Bergman's another one, but I'm trying to think of the French filmmaker that Hitchcock was so enamored with.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't
Trufant.
matter. Trufant, thank you. So, all right, that would take us into generally discussing this movie, but as we do every week, let's give everybody some background on this movie so they can kind of follow us along. If you have not watched the film, we will give you a plot summary and then kind of just generally discuss the film. So, Dad, do you have yours ready?
I do. Bandits threaten a mountain village, likely stealing their crops and leaving them to starve. The village elders suggest hiring a samurai to protect them. They soon hire Kambei Shimada, played by Takashi Shimura, and he puts together a band of 5 other samurai. Harassed by Kikuchiyo, played by Toshia Mufune.
Okay. Do you need me to do the name readings? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in this position.
Toshio
Toshiro Mifune.
Mifune, Toshiro Mifune,
There you
who
go.
lies about being a samurai. Soon he becomes an emotional leader, and they set out to fight the bandits and save the village, coming together as a band of brothers trying to save the day.
Excellent. Cast, and forgive me if my pronunciations are bad. I've been trying to practice them this afternoon. Off the top, probably one of the most prolific and celebrated actors internationally ever, Toshiro Mifune as Kikuchiyo. Chio. Kikuchiyo. Gosh, this is not my first language. Takashi Shimura as Kambei Shimada. Daisuke Kaito as Shichiroji. Isao Kimura as Katsushiro Akamoto. Minoru Chayaki as Heihachi Hayashida. Seiji Miyaguchi as Kyuzo. Yoshio Inaba as Gorobe Katayama. Yoshio Tsuchiya as Rikichi. Bokuzen Hidari as Yohei. Yukiko Shimazaki as Rikichi's wife. Kamatari Fujiwara as Manzo. Keiko Tsushima as Shino. And Kokuten Kodo as Gisaku. That is the best I'm going to be able to do, folks. Recognition for this film. In 1982, it was voted number 3 in the Sight and Sound Critics Poll of Greatest Films. If you're not familiar, Sight and Sound's Critics Poll as to the greatest film of all time is often recognized as the best critics poll as to the greatest films. And currently, I think the resident number 1 film of all time is Vertigo. In Sight and Sound Directors Poll, it was voted at number 10 in 1992 and number 9 in 2002. It also ranked number 17 on the 2012 Sight and Sound Critics Poll, in both cases being tied with Kurosawa's own Rashomon, from 1950. It also ranked at number 17 in 2012 Sight and Sound Directors Poll. In 1998, the film was ranked at number 5 in Time Out magazine's top 100 films. In 2000, the film was ranked at number 23 in the Village Voice's 100 Greatest Films list. Seven Samurai has also been ranked number 1 on Empire magazine's list of the 100 best films of world cinema in 2010. Kurosawa both directed and edited many of his films, including Seven Samurai. In 2012, the Motion Pictures Editors Guild listed Seven Samurai as the 33rd best edited film of all time based on a survey of its members. In 2018, it was voted the greatest foreign language film of all time in BBC's poll of 209 critics in 43 countries. In 2019, when Time Out polled film critics, directors, actors, and stunt actors, Seven Samurai was voted the second best action film of all time. Did you know? Did you know? Often credited as the first modern action movie. Many now commonly use cinematographic and plot elements such as slow motion for dramatic flair and reluctant hero, to name a couple, are seen for perhaps the first time. Other movies may have used them separately before, but Akira Kirosawa brought them all together. Did you know? Not only was this Toshiro Mifune's favorite of his own films, but he named Kikuchiyo as his favorite role because he was able to, quote, be himself. Did you know? This film is often described as the greatest Japanese film ever made, including by well-known Japanese film historian Donald Ricci and by Entertainment Weekly in its list of 100 greatest films of all time. Interestingly, despite its widespread commercial popularity, it was not particularly highly regarded by Japanese critics at the time of its release. The early 1950s is now regarded as a sort of golden age of Japanese cinema. Did you know? As the production process grew longer and longer, producers grew worried that Akira Kirosawa was spending too much time on the film. As a result, production was closed down at least twice. Instead of arguing, Kurosawa simply left to go fishing, believing that the studio had already invested so much money into the film that they wouldn't simply scrap it. He was right. Did you know? The first draft, written by Shinobu Hashimoto, was written freely, as instructed by Kurosawa, and wound up being 500 pages long. Seiji Miyaguchi, who played the taciturn samurai Kyozu, had not touched a sword at all before this movie. Editing and careful cinematography were both used to give the impression that he was a master. Did you know? Shortly before filming of the battle sequence began, heavy snow fell, which meant the crew had to water down the set in order to melt the snow. That, plus the scripted plan to shoot the sequence in a dramatic torrential downpour, meant that the cast was working in deep, thick mud. Because it was the dead of winter, the mud would often grow frozen, leaving the cast in their period-accurate sandals freezing as they tried to carry out the action. Kurosawa himself, who stood in the mud with his actors, apparently grew so cold that he started to lose his toenails. Did you know, at 207 minutes, this would be the longest picture of Akira Kurosawa's career? Alright, Dad, so what do you think this movie is about?
It is a coming together of a band or a group of people to achieve an ultimate goal or to triumph good over evil.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest element of this that ends up being its legacy is the team up aspect and how all of these pieces fit together. They're able to find basically this band of misfits that ends up working together for a common cause. I kind of went slightly in that direction, but action adventure film about noble samurai coming together to play the protector of a desperate village. That's the most obvious one statement you could say about this movie. I think there's more depth to it the further on you look, but it was really hard for me to put my finger on exactly what that was.
Well, ultimately, the setting only adds to the underlying story. I mean, I remember the story about when the Sopranos was pitched to HBO. They came in and talked about a guy in a midlife crisis. He has a psychiatrist. He has to come to terms with his own aging, and they go through the whole thing. And HBO says, "Well, we like it. We'll probably go forward with it." And then they get up to leave and goes, "Oh, did I forget to mention that he also happens to be a gangster running a mob?" And right there, HBO took it. The point I'm making is that this is exactly the same thing, which is this is a story about a band of brothers, and he put it into a time frame of cultural and historic significance to the Japanese. It's interesting that, of course, what does Americans do with it? They immediately make it into a western.
I think there is something to be said how well the adaptation could go from one to the other, but I think having already seen The Magnificent Seven, and this is my first time viewing this in totality, I think I've watched pieces of it before, that there are themes from this movie that are not correctly adapted to the American version. The American version cuts out a lot of the have and have not aspects of this, where you could theoretically say, particularly in the character of Kikuchiyo, that him being a former farmer and now fitting in as, I guess, one of the samurai is bringing together two worlds that really would never be together. These essentially are guys for hire that are trying to feed themselves on the desperation of the farmers, yet the farmers are clearly holding back from them, as evidenced by the end of the film and as predicted earlier in his speech. So you're getting this disparity where there's desperation in several realms. None of these people are rich. In fact, you also get another scene where the bandits are starving and feel they need to rob this village specifically to take care of themselves and survive. So you have a lot of desperate people on all sides trying to act in their own best interest, but doing so in ways that really are counterintuitive to the nature of what we had described or how we've described this film so far, which is a team up.
But you could place this into any situation or circumstance. You could set it in modern Somalia and have the same type of thing. You could set it into Afghanistan. You could set it wherever there's a potential of conflict or lawlessness. You could establish or set this film.
I know we're waiting till next week to do the direct compare and contrast, so forgive me a little bit in projecting that on. I just think that that particular character, I can't remember any of the Magnificent Seven being adapted from the Mifune character.
No, not really.
And I think that loses an element of what this film really is or the depth that it brings. All right. So, who for you then was the best performer?
Kurosawa. The only problem I have with this film is it was too samurai, too money. It should have been shorter. The first, I broke it into segments watching it because of my time constraints. I just didn't have 3.5 hours to sit at one time. And the first hour, drug. And I think you could have chopped chunks out of that and probably gotten this film down to 2.5 hours, and it would have flown better. So, but overall, the cinematography, the angles, the methods used, the action sequences, how the camera was aligned to give the illusion of being piked by sharpened wooden sticks and being slain by a sword and etc. It was very well done, and the last hour was just spectacular. The fight or the true combat scenes were extremely well done and very powerful and entertaining. So to that extent, I would go with Kurosawa.
Since this movie does have an intermission to it, I agree with you that the second half is much more watchable than the first half. It takes them, frankly, way too long to get to the point where they're even going to the village in order to seek out samurai. That whole sequence seems a little bit overlong, and that's being a little bit kind in just my opinion. I also think it takes them a little bit too long sometimes where they are doing it for the sake of time and it feels authentic, but it takes a little bit too long to get everybody assembled and then get them all into the position where they're with the villagers. But that does create a level of intimacy and relationships that are more effective and sold in the second half of the film. So while there are parts that were small pieces I would chop out of this. I don't know if I could probably come up with more than a half an hour out of the total runtime.
Well, I'm one who really thinks that for whatever reason, films which tend to be conceived or thought about as being artistic tend to be long, and they tend to have areas where there could be some editing to improve the flow. But artistically, you can't say that. And I'm not going to mention any films like Gandhi or Dances with Wolves where you could have chopped 20 minutes to 40 minutes out without hurting the film one bit.
Oh, you can chop a good hour out of Dances with Wolves.
Well, I mean, did I really? And I remember going to the theater, or I was commenting about this, watching Gandhi, and I was with my friend Eric Stoner, and Gandhi's on top of a train, and they're showing the scenes of India, and I finally, after 15 minutes, turn and says, "Gandhi ever going to get off this fucking train?" And
See, I don't nearly have as many critical issues with Gandhi as far as length, nearly as much as I do with something like The Deer Hunter, which is the record Best Picture winner for longest film. But that wedding sequence at the beginning just drags so terribly long. It's like watching somebody's homemade wedding video and watching it in its entirety.
yeah,
The point of the film is for them to go away to Vietnam. Why do we have to sit through this entire wedding ceremony?
yeah, I remember when Reds came out, which was the Warren Beatty, Diane Keaton film that Warren Beatty wrote and directed, based upon uh, a group of intellectuals that went to help the Soviets rise to power, and half the film is Diane Keaton and Warren Beatty looking at each other, and the camera panning back, and I'm like, why do we need to see this over and over and over? Okay.
Let's not even get started on things like The Last Emperor or Out of Africa. But anyway, let's move forward. My best performer was Toshiro Mifune. And for a while, I didn't think that would be the case. For probably a good hour and a half of the beginning of this movie, he either was wild and unplaced. Like I couldn't figure out what he was supposed to be, but I think he's the emotional heart of this movie. And the range of different things he has to play, from both the comedic lead at times being somewhat of the levity character to being the emotional center at times, and the person who seems to feel yet not want to feel as much as any other character. Many of the rest of the samurai are all stoic, yet he almost wears every emotion on his sleeve, and he becomes engrossing in the way that he just plays this character who's so rowdy, yet you probably connect with the best because he's of both worlds.
Well, I actually had him for most charismatic because I thought he kind of had a presence on the screen that drew you to him. His overall behavior. So I agree with you, and that's pretty much the same reasons that I had for that. So I just took that out of order simply because I thought it would be
That's fair. I understand. Okay, so that was your most charismatic. Who is your best secondary performer?
Shimura. He had a quality about him, a kind of a wry smile, a quietness that you could see just by his expressions and body language that he was always in control of himself and his situation, and that others looked to him for leadership and for wisdom. And that smile always, there was a quality about it that was likable, even though he was a warrior. And I think sometimes you're not really supposed to like samurai because they are warriors more or less for hire, and but he just had a quality about him that made him endearing. I'm not sure other actors would have necessarily been able to do that and pull that type of performance off.
For the sake of accuracy, I do need to make one small note that a samurai is technically contracted, but a ronin is for hire. It's the same type of person. It's just whether or not you are available or not. So apparently there is a distinction without a ton of difference. Just wanted to make that note. But I also had Shimura as my best secondary performer. He was incredibly likable. And having seen both films, you can definitely see why Yul Brynner was cast to play that role. That the way he depicts that pillar of strength of all knowing, you said it in the wry smile, that he always seems to have the upper hand and never be phased by anything that's going on. He almost has this elder wisdom, much in the same way that the villagers look to the quote unquote old man or grandfather. He is seen as the elder statesman, the leader. He has never departed from that, and he leads these people ably without really ever being phased by any of it. And his just demeanor, I really find that it would have been difficult for most people to be able to play this just so confidently in the way that he does. All right, so then we'll move on to my most charismatic. And I went in a slightly different direction, but I don't know if we've discussed it on the podcast before, but since she was our guest last week, Mom has a favorite cartoon character. It's Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. And she likes Eeyore specifically because he's the sad sack. And you just feel bad and you want to wrap him up and put him in a blanket and give him a hot cup of tea. And that's how I felt almost the entire movie about Bokuzen Hidari, who played Yohei. Because every time you see his face, he just looks like he's got this sheer look of terror anytime. And Kikuchiyo is always making fun of, what are you looking at? You know, it's just, he has this endearing quality to me that I just love about him. And then it's so emotional when he dies and how much it ends up affecting Mifune's character, that might be one of the emotional moments of the movie, that he ended up standing his post. He's kind of that sad sack that everybody kind of takes advantage of, but ultimately I found him to be by far the best villager character and the one that I probably related to most, because in most circumstances when you're facing a horde of 40 bandits and you've been run over and abused most of your life, you'd have that shocked look, and now you're trying to fight back for the first time and it's so uncomfortable for you, but he just ends up filling the exact role he was meant to play. All right, so we'll move over to best scene. Do you have a first nominee?
The scouting party. I thought that scene was kind of comical. It could have been shorter, but I thought it was kind of comical as they're trying to figure out how they're going to approach samurai to hire. And it looks like the blind leading the blind.
So I was a little bit confused when you said scouting party, because I thought you might have meant later on in the film where they have the three scouts that they discover. But
No.
so more or less you mean that opening part of the film when they're going to look for the type of samurai they need in order to help save the village.
Yes.
Just wanted to clear that up. Something, or my first nominee is just after that. I'm going to go with Kyozo wins a duel. And it's that moment in the film where they're looking for these other samurai to bring with them or to team up with. And he is the revered, legendary, almost mythical swordsman who tries to give this guy a break. The first image we see of him is in this, I guess you could say, fake duel without swords. And he's basically saying, I would have killed you had it not been, or had this actually been with real steel. And then he does it. And there's such a great aspect to that finality of the scene where you get the slow motion and where he touches his sword. Obviously, the sword play was not great. We're dealing with older technology, but the fact that we were even willing and able to do that reminds me so much of some of the effects that we got way, way years later in The Matrix. And so I just enjoyed that scene for setting up the character and what he would end up being, because there's a lot that's said in that first introduction to his character as to how his character plays out through the course of the film.
I have the samurai in the bandit camp as another scene.
So is this the one where they burn down the opposing like area?
Yes.
Okay, I had this one as well. What did you have it for?
Well, I thought it was a great transitional piece. You could see at that point in time that things were turning, and that the you could it was a foreshadow of the outcome of the film, more or less, that they were going to ultimately be able to prevail because they were able to outwit the bandits, and it showed to some extent just the sheer level of inhumanity, because it just they ended up killing and burning men and women indiscriminately, in part because it's survival of the fittest in that context, both men and women. So the villagers would have been just as likely starved or killed as the men and women as bandits as well. So
Well, I nominated it for a couple of things because there were several big emotional moments in that where they don't overstate it. There's a lot of undertones because they don't go through a ton to explain, or I guess they don't give you a lot of exposition to figure this out until the very end of the scene. And you have to get it somewhat from context clues. But Rikichi's wife is or has been taken as a concubine by the bandits, obviously at a previous time. And instead of facing up the disgrace she now feels for essentially being a rape victim many times over, she instead walks back into the burning building to not have to deal with that ever again. And that is haunting on its own. But then you get that he is so just taken on with sadness and grief and anger and all of these pieces built up inside of him. And the other samurai are trying to pull him out of there, and in the process you lose one of them as their number, and it's the first one that you've really lost. They hadn't suffered any major losses to that point, so it kind of has such an emotional hang on where the rest of the course of this movie goes, because obviously by the time we get to the end we've lost four of the primary party. So my next one, and I found this a little bit difficult to nominate specific scenes, which you wouldn't think with a 3.5 hour movie, but a lot of these things kind of ran together, so it didn't feel like there was one particular scene that is set apart in any course of the film. There are moments, but not necessarily a long scene that you can really cut apart. So it was a little difficult to try and piece all of this out. But I'm going to go with Kikuchiyo joins in. And by that, I mean when he drunkenly is presented and they hit him over the head, and he kind of joins in with the rest of the group, but then he has that drunken rampage trying to catch Katsushiro around the barn, and the amount of energy and playfulness that was involved, and it really started to show how much of the character Mifune had gotten into in order to play this part, because there's so much there to deal with, even in that kind of like rampaging rage state that he's in, that's just wild and all over the place.
I think, wasn't that partly also his disclosure, where it comes out that he
I had that as a different scene to nominate because that's a
okay,
little bit later.
and I have that one,
Okay.
the scroll where they're making fun of him being he claims that he's a samurai, and if the scroll were accurate, he'd be like 13.
And a woman.
And okay, I missed that part, but yeah, okay.
Well, it's not only that, but I'm going to have his monologue from that as one of the few best quotes I could pull out of that. And basically explaining not only his character, but his motivations through the course of the film. I think it's one of the more powerful moments in that movie where you can see it from all sides, and that there's a really nuanced view of all of this. That the farmers are cheap, they are conniving, and they've had to learn to adapt to be that way because of the way that or I guess the Japanese feudal system had kind of forced them into that kind of life and that mentality. And I think that becomes or takes on the rest of the movie, or as far as the overarching theme. So it weighs much more heavily. I thought it was a really important movie, or excuse me, a really important moment to how to view the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
Because realistically, this becomes not only a relationship between the samurai, but between the samurai and the villagers, capped off by that haunting few lines by Shimura at the end of the movie.
I have the first attack as another scene that I liked. The concept of letting in a couple at a time and then killing them off and systematically destroying the bandits, I thought was a brilliant concept. And it took a while for them to seem to figure that one out, but it was a good concept, a good idea, and gave them the advantage. So I liked that, and I thought it was good action.
I think it would be a little bit unfair to compare that final battle because it really only acts as one final sequence in something like the Magnificent Seven to how they have to almost individually pick off every single bandit when it's by swords. I started questioning towards the middle of this film. Okay, none of them really has guns. I didn't expect the muskets to show up, and that did play a huge role in some of the final sequences of this movie. But if none of these guys have guns and there's no long range, and how are they going to make this into one final sequence? And it ended up playing out as like four final battle sequences or four action sequences, including that one. I do like the ingenuity, but also the accuracy, because while at times I would have probably criticized this, maybe even a couple of years ago, for being overlong and why didn't you just combine them for the sake of being cinematic? By doing it in a more accurate fashion, and yes, it ends up being longer, it still doesn't necessarily feel too overlong, in my opinion, from where I sit right now. And it is more authentic to how this would have actually had to gone down instead of forcing it in a way where it wouldn't have been accurate. So I do appreciate it in the same way as you there. All right. I apparently only nominated really heavy scenes, but I have the next one being Katsushiro, quote unquote, becomes a man, since that's how they allude to it later on in the film. But it was a odd choice to add that relationship into this film. I don't know if you really needed a love story, but it did in essence show the final difference and add to that final scene where there's the separation between those of high class, high military training, like the samurai, who can be brought in but will never truly be a part of the villagers. I don't think you get that when you're talking about something like the Magnificent Seven, which we're going to do next week, where it always seems like they're more alike than different. They're not separated by the same themes of class or, in some ways, sex, as is depicted in this movie, where there seems to be like these two, while they may team up, are worlds apart.
Well, and it the class system or the differentiation classes in Japan is long and deep seated in their history and culture, and that's just not the case in the United States because most of the time people in the United States came from the lower classes and were coming here to escape. So we didn't have a huge class system. The class system in the United States developed ultimately based on money.
And race.
Well, that's true.
You were never too poor as a white person as long as you were less poor than a black person
Yeah.
and less disadvantaged. All right. Anyway, before we take it too far down that rabbit hole, did you have another scene?
Just the climactic scene. The
Okay, that was the
last
last one
scene.
I had as well.
That's also my favorite scene because it just seemed like it ran beautifully. It was quick. The pacing was great. The action, the shots. There was nothing that drug in it. You felt part of it, and I don't know. I just thought it was done well. It was a scene that went so quickly. I wish it would have been the pacing and action level of more of the film.
I'm going to appreciate it for one particular moment within that. And I run basically that ending battle sequence up from when the final 13 come into the camp and they allow them there so they can trap them and basically kill them off before they become any more exhausted. But all the way through literally the last moment of the film. So I'm going to treat that all as one. But there are two moments that I feel really highlight this entire sequence, other than the action, which count me a little spoiled that I've seen a lot of modern action films that probably could have done a lot of the swordsmanship and military fighting and a lot of that better. I can still appreciate what they were capable of doing in 1954, but you can definitely see where somebody in a modern sense would go a lot differently. That being said, when Kyuzo ends up dying at the hands of the musket because the chief has locked himself in with the other villagers, and Mifune's character Kikuchiyo ends up running in after him at the sacrifice of himself because you knew he'd make some sort of sacrificial play. But in order to kill the chief and end this, somewhat in grief, but some out of just pure rage and anger at all of the people he seemingly connects with or cares about dying off, and that he takes a personal vendetta to it all, I thought was a really endearing ending for that character with how troubled he was that Yohei had passed away and then several of the other samurai, and then to get it on that final nail and for him to be the one that basically ends the battle at that point, killing the chief despite having been shot himself. Then topped off with that ending sequence with Shimura basically insinuating again, and it was something that I guess I didn't grapple with until after the film because it sat with me how right he was, but that here's the main difference I see in between the two films. And again, I know I'm making a lot of compare contrast, but we were deciding to do parts of that where it's celebratory in the Magnificent Seven, particularly for the survivors. The weight of the losses, particularly of the four samurai that ends up dying by the end of this film, weighs much more heavily. This is a somewhat somber film in its ending because the samurai don't take joy in the victory that they had. The villagers do, but they don't feel that they can ever be a part of it. And so I wondered why, and it took me a while to think through exactly why that situation was, but it's why I've ended up highlighting so much of the difference in the themes between the two classes when it comes to this film, and why I feel as strongly about the depth was because it didn't make sense to me at the time, but once it did, it hit me that much harder. So you said that was your favorite scene?
Yes.
Okay. I have down Kikuchiyo as sharing his background being my favorite, again, because I think that is probably the emotional pivotal scene on which the second half of the movie works. As far as the most indelible moment, though, I find it to be that final battle, particularly Kikuchiyo and his demise. But what do you have as your most indelible then?
The same, the ending and in that, yes.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us. Dad, do we have anybody to remember this week?
Actually, no, and that's a good thing. We don't want to lose people, but there was no noteworthy actors or movie related people. The only person that would be quasi related is because of certain films. Michael Collins, who was the pilot of the Columbia spacecraft for Apollo 11, died today, but he wasn't an actor. He just was portrayed in at least one film that I know about the moon landing. That being the Damien Chazelle film, First Man. But that's the extent of it.
So, with that being said, we'll move into best slash funniest lines. I don't find there to be, even though there were parts that were humorous, they seemed to be physical comedy more than anything that related across languages. But the other thing is I feel a little complicated in nominating best lines for a translated film. There are a couple that stuck out to me that I'll still do, but given that these are not in their original language, I don't know if they have the same intent. So, with that asterisk being placed on it, do you have any best lines to nominate?
Well, I have one, and it's the last line because when he was said, I'm like, wow, that's good. In the end, we lost this battle too. The victory belongs to the peasants, not to us.
That seems like somewhat of a paraphrase. I had either a different translation or something else. I had Shimada, again, we are defeated. The farmers have won, not us. So maybe it's a difference in translation. I had two others. This is the nature of war. By protecting others, you save yourself. If you only think of yourself, you'll only destroy yourself. One that just stuck out to me. But then, as I mentioned before, Kikuchiyo, as to his explanation of relating to the farmers and giving them the layer of nuance. What do you think of farmers? You think they're saints? Ha! They're foxy beasts. They say, we've got no rice, we've got no wheat, we've got nothing. But they have. They have everything. Dig under the floors or search the barns. You'll find plenty beans, salt, rice, sake. Look in the valleys. They've got hidden warehouses. They pose as saints but are full of lies. If they smell a battle, they hunt the defeated. They're nothing but stingy, greedy, blubbering, foxy, and mean. God damn it all. But then, who made them such beasts? You did. You samurai did. You burn their villages, destroy their farms, steal their food, force them to labor, take their women, and kill them if they resist. So what should farmers do? And with that, let's go to our Stanley rubric. First up is legacy. What do you have down, Dad?
9.5. This has been remade so many times, and really, I think there's a certain element of this in tons of films. I saw certain elements of this in The Dirty Dozen. I saw certain elements of this in the HBO series Band of Brothers. I saw certain elements of this in a whole host of different films, including Star Wars and including anything where they're building a team and getting together. So that's why I went with a 9.5 because I think it's had a great impact on cinema and storytelling for the most part.
Obviously, auteurs, actors, film lovers, those people that are involved or are part of the industry or love the industry, love and appreciate and know this movie. Outside of that, that's where we have a true gap. I think if you asked a random person on the street, they might have heard of something called the Magnificent Seven. I don't know how many just general people would know that there was even a movie called Seven Samurai. So here is the question I will pose to you because I had a slightly lower score. I'm willing to potentially come up because I do appreciate how influential this movie is. My problem comes in where it is influential, but nobody knows it's influential other than the people that it actually influenced. So, is it more important for legacy to be known on your own or to have impact?
Yes.
It's not a yes question. It is
Yes,
in
it
this case.
is. It's
I
it's
understand where you're
both
trying to go on.
answers.
I understand where you're trying to go, but I really need it is in this case an either or.
Okay, it's not. You can't do an either or because it just depends. I mean, how many politicians have there been that are the ones that are in power, but there's somebody behind them who's got the real power and who is pulling the strings and really exercising the influence and power because they, for other reasons, can't. They lack a certain tact or finesse or likability. Does that make them any less powerful than the politician who actually controls their own agenda? No, it's the same thing. It's just it's how it impacts it and if it impacts it. And at both sides of this, it can be the same thing. I don't think I'm looking at the legacy as being not not just the entity itself, but the influence of the entity on so much. You can look at a situation like King Lear. Okay, King Lear by itself is a great play, and people know King Lear. But how many times have you looked at it and seen that somehow King Lear has been altered or changed and made into another story that's been in the cinema? So does that make it any less? Is it King Lear only as King Lear, or is it King Lear as its influence on other drama or cinematic vehicles?
Well, by that extension, you could make something like Knives Out be identifiable as King Lear.
Correct. You could even go to that extent. I'm just saying it's a little less direct, but still, you're coming to the same ultimate conclusion. And so I couldn't segregate whether I thought about, well, the legacy of this film is that it really nobody knows it here and it's really not that important, blah blah blah. But then I started thinking about how it's influenced so many things directly that are so prevalent and significant in culture and society, not just in the United States, but across Europe and Asia. So I had to go with the higher number.
Okay, but on that basis, and this is where I'm saying why we have to have the discussion between the two, because it knocks down theoretically every film that it's then based on for a legacy aspect in some capacity. Because if you go on the total impact aspect, and I know we have a category that says impact significance, but that does or represents something else most of the time. If you add up the impact or the legacy of Star Wars, The Matrix, John Wick, most modern action films, the Kill Bill movies, you could start going through all these random movies and film franchises and throw all of these together. The Avengers movies has a team up aspect. You want to throw all of those together, then I don't know how you argue less than a 10.
Well, you have to look at it if it influenced it, and then the second part of it is it a direct influence? And it you can have a direct influence or you can have a significant influence, and that's the difference. I think this film was a significant influence on a lot, and so that's why I cannot give it a direct 10.
I think it's a direct influence, in fact, because not only does somebody like George Lucas directly mention Kurosawa and has said so on multiple occasions, but you just look at some of the imagery. When you talk about the weaponry, a lightsaber is no different than the swords they're wielding in this movie. Hidden Fortress has often been credited with being the direct link to how they set up the original Star Wars movie, because that's what the Death Star is the Hidden Fortress. But yet the team up aspect comes from Seven Samurai. So there's a direct inspiration to some of the most influential filmmakers of American cinematic history and some of the biggest film franchises. I maybe there's some influence where you could say, okay, it directly impacted Magnificent Seven. And by extension, then Magnificent Seven does this, this, and this, and you get three other movies past it that are based loosely on the next one down the list, or just in a general sense. So let's say The Avengers, particularly, is not a direct influence, but it is influenced. Even then, you still start stacking up the list of films that either had a direct influence or an indirect influence, and I still don't know how I don't get to a 10 based on that argument, which is exactly why I posed the question to begin with. Because originally I had an 8.5, but I'm almost arguing myself into a 10 at this point.
Well, I can tell you why I went one step down, which is only those who are making films and are film critics are familiar with the film.
which is part of the question I asked, but then you tried to factor that out.
Yes, but the fact that it has general, not general knowledge, but its impact has been significant, prevents it from being a 10. I don't know how you go through this. Maybe, and I haven't thought about this. I'm just trying to think of a film that would be a 10. And
So when we talk about legacy, I think the only one that we agreed on a straight 10 was Jaws.
yeah. I'm thinking possibly Gone with the Wind because it was an epic and it was really the first time piece or time film epic that transitioned, and all of them come from that. But again, that's a film that everybody knows. You may not have seen it, but if you mention it, a lot of people have more knowledge of it being a film than of it being a book. And so, to that extent, I would go with a 10 as far as legacy. And I'm not, please don't lock me into that when we get around to doing that.
Well,
But
I was going to say, but the reason I even asked the question to begin with is we have to have a way of accurately and fairly assessing these on an equal basis. And by extension, I feel that if we lock ourselves in on one thing, but then change our minds next week and don't apply the same standards, that now the list is faulty.
I think there's two aspects that you have to consider. One is its impact on cinema and culture in general, and two, its impact on society in general. And the fact that nobody knows of this film in the United States for the most part prevents it from being a 10. Now, if it were a film that everybody knew, I mean, to be honest, I can tell you right now,
Okay, so
Legacy, you're going to probably have a 10 for Psycho because the method used and the element created by Hitchcock through editing and camera angles and such is going to have an influence over so many horror and thriller movies. And then on top of it, if you say Psycho, most people in this country are familiar and have a certain knowledge of the film. They may never have seen it, but they're aware of it and they know that there's a big scene in there in the shower. And so, to that extent, that's where I'm going. It's got to be not only impactful on the industry, but it has to be impactful on society.
so I pose this as the argumentative question then. And I apologize in advance to any non-sports fans. Who is the greater Packer, Vince Lombardi or Curly Lambeau? That's what this feels to me. Because if we come back and we say Star Wars is a 10 for legacy, because I have a feeling it's going to be, and then we say this is a 9.5, that doesn't feel as even to me unless we put that exact definition on it in advance.
Well, again, and if you're going to use that analogy, then I would point out that you talk to the casual fan from around the country who's familiar with American football, and you mention Lambeau and Lombardi. Lambeau is a stadium, and Lombardi is the greatest coach of all time.
No, Bill Belichick is. I'm
Okay,
sorry. Unfortunately, I have to go there. I don't like it at all. Anyway, let's move off of it, but I'll come to my final score. It's down to me. You've already given yours. I'm going to reluctantly say, because even in the last analogy I made, I would argue in the same manner you did. So I will give it a 9.5, and we can agree to that.
all right.
So then the average is easy since we had the same score.
So a long way to go in order for you to agree with me. It would have been just simpler.
I seem to remember saying that often before. Impact significance, what did you have down?
5. Again, and I went middle of the road because it's had a big influence on those who are of influence, but it has had only impacts secondarily through the rest of at least American culture. And I guess that's what I have to ultimately agree or consider is impact and significance has to be based on America, or at least us as Americans. I can't judge necessarily the impact of films overseas because I'm not necessarily familiar with the impact of it overseas.
I don't even think this movie came to the States until many decades later, other than people within the industry. Now, I know that this was the biggest Japanese film for a long time in just gross box office receipts. And it outgrossed Godzilla that year, which is obviously another famous property. So this was a huge Japanese film. In that sense, you could give it credit. But at the same time, I have to look at the contemporary critic reviews. And if a lot of those were mixed or up and down, I don't know how much this resonated as far as like the. I'm trying to think what would this end up being? It would be similar to like if I don't know 30 years from now, all of a sudden we treat the Avenger films as somehow a high form of art.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we deadpan like all the auteurs, the Scorseses of the world, just cannot go a day without criticizing how popular film is not real film, which bugs me because as much as I like Marty, he's just dead wrong. But anyway, the point being that this was a popular film, but it was not necessarily thought of as a critical art form until many years later. And so by that extension, I'm going to agree to your 5.
All right.
All right. Novelty. What did you have down?
I went with an 8 because it wasn't the first time I'd seen this kind of more or less a period piece or had the united front type of mentality, but it was I don't think there was ever anything samurai or that whole concept before, so I went with an 8 for that reason. This was difficult for me simply because of it being a foreign film and not being able to really gauge how much it may have impacted or where it was in general in the pop culture.
That's fair. I can't think of many big set piece action movies that come to mind immediately before this. I know there are epic movies, but can you really name a huge action set piece to Gone with the Wind? Like this felt very much stylistically in the same way that I would put All Quiet on the Western Front, but with just better camera work and ability. Like they were a little bit more advanced in what they knew how to do. So I'm gonna go
Uh, I can. All the war films that were done in the 40s, like Sands of Iwo Jima and such.
okay to an extent. But all right, so here are the parts story wise. This is very much the harbinger of this, I guess, if you could say, genre of storytelling when it comes to samurai and martial arts and some of the stuff that we've come to know from that form of action film. This isn't the first samurai film per se. I'm not even completely sure this would be the first one of Kurosawa, but it does set up things like Throne of Blood, Yojimbo, Hidden Fortress that would all come later, and kind of this samurai portion of Mifune's career as well. So you got to give it a little bit of credit on that side. The team up aspect from a storytelling perspective, the giant action set pieces, particularly hand to hand combat and sword play, I think those are all novel. I would also say that teaming, while we mentioned it earlier on in the Did You Know section, use of like slow motion for action set pieces and some of the other stylistic choices for effect are when they were all combined adds a certain level of novelty to this as well as an action movie. So I went with a 9. I don't think it's 100% original, but I think that's a good place to put it.
What did you have for classicness?
And this is probably the category I almost always struggle on the most. I went with an 8.5. I said in the last few weeks, I've started where I start from an 8, and I can only give you points up if something was either like, if it's a comedy, if it's still really funny and it holds up, and there aren't any points to really weigh back against it, or it's prescient, is another word we've been using the last few weeks. But so this one, I started at an 8. I think it was ahead of its time on some of the action sequences in the set pieces, as I mentioned before, with novelty, and has somewhat of a harbinger effect on where modern action movies were going to go, particularly out of the samurai sword fighting martial arts genre. The few things you could maybe pick out as far as cringiness are the differences between sex and class, but I view those more through a historically accurate lens. And so I really didn't take any points off. And because I think that some of this had a leading effect or an impact effect, I don't want to give it too much because we've given that points in other categories. But I went with an 8.5.
Well, I'm going to make it really tough for you to calculate this.
You went with an 8.5?
Yes. And again, it's because this is a historical film. The depiction of the relationship between classes and especially between women would normally be a point of departure. But let's be realistic. This is supposed to be set in like 1580. We're not talking about overly enlightened thought when it comes to the sexes. So I guess I didn't have necessarily a problem with it. So that's why I went with an 8.5. Much of what I do is I always start when I'm assessing something at 50-50, and I go up or down from there. And in this particular case, I looked at it and I went through kind of my mental checklist of things that I thought were cringeworthy. And I kind of took off certain things or added certain things in kind of a half point. That's where I came up with was 8.5.
So that takes us to rewatchability. You know me, I'm pretty sure you and I kind of judge these the same way. Start at a 5, and does it go up? Does it go down? I'd be a little bit passive, but I enjoyed parts of this film. The fact that you have to be in the right frame of mind in order to watch it because of the language barrier doesn't make it as accessible as some other classic films that are more favorites of mine. I could very easily see myself going back and watching this, but again, it's got to be the right time, and I probably won't do it for a while. So I went with a 6.
Ooh, we're vastly different. Just the sheer fact of having to sit and pay attention and read through and I'll be honest, I read a synopsis of the film before I started watching it, so I had some idea of what was going on because I have a hard time sometimes paying attention to the action and reading at the same time. So maybe I'm undervaluing it a little, but I went with a 3.
That's fine. So that's 4.5 between us. And that takes us to our audience scores. So we had a 9.3 or 93% for Google users. Oddly enough, I thought this would have been lower, but 97% of Rotten Tomato users actually have approved of the film. So that ends up with a 9.5 overall score for that. So let's add these all up. That's 9.5 for Legacy. That is 5 for Impact Significance, 8.5 for Novelty, 8.5 for Classicness, 4.5 for Rewatchability, and 9.5 for Audience Score gives us a final total of 45.5 and puts it just between Bull Durham and Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Okay.
As much as this is a legacy film and has so much impact and is kind of a auteur's film at this point, I would have thought it would have been a little bit higher, but I guess I understand where some of the pointing comes in. This might be one that we might think differently of down the line.
Maybe.
So, all right. Final remaining questions.
No, other than that, I kind of just was curious as to what ended up happening to the village and what ended up happening to the samurai.
So, what happens to the samurai was my leftover question, just because, again, they kind of, or where we leave off in the movie, they're not celebrating the victory. They feel it more a defeat for themselves. They lost their people. And while several of the villagers did die, ultimately they are saved, but the samurai have to move on. So, what do they move on to? I agree in that sense. The other one for me, though, was Shino, the female character who ends up having the love tryst in this one. Given how things went down and her father, and historically, what happens to her, I'd be very curious, since usually marriages happen between or within villages. Given that she had such a public, almost shaming at the end before that final battle, I don't know if she is, because I mean her father insinuates she is quote unquote damaged goods. What exactly happens with her life going forward, given that she clearly is not going to end up marrying the samurai?
Yeah.
All right, any last thoughts?
No, I'm good.
All right, sounds good. Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else, just us and the microphones, and those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Next week, we will be doing The Magnificent Seven, currently streaming on Starz, or if you have the premium subscription through Prime or Hulu. You won't want to miss that one. Please like, subscribe, review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at GModePodcast, or find Dana or I on Twitter at TJ3Duncan or at Dana W. Duncan. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.